Peace be upon you, friends. With you is your friend Darum. I ask you to support the channel by subscribing, liking, and posting motivating comments and an enjoyable viewing experience for you.
Dear Mrs. Budd, I served your daughter cheese and strawberries. We had our lunch. She sat on my lap and kissed me. Then I decided to eat it. How delicious it tasted. The writer of the letter was the serial killer Albert Fish, but it was an anonymous letter that Mrs. Budd received 6 years after the disappearance of her child and searching for her. She did not know who the sender was, but investigations concluded that it was Albert Fish. Albert was born on May 19, 1870 in Washington, D.C., into a family with a long history of psychological and mental illness. His uncle suffered from religious obsession. His sister lived in a mental hospital, and some other members of his family suffered from auditory and visual hallucinations. As for his father, who was over 75 years old and about 50 years older than his mother, he abandoned him at an early age and sent him to an orphanage. This home was a place of extreme brutality and violence, during which he was subjected to regular beatings, insults, torture, and many other sadistic acts, as the administration of the home encouraged the children to harm each other. Then Albert began to have a different definition of violence, as it is an act that brings happiness to the one who does it, and perhaps from here began his brutal journey about this period. Albert said, "I was there until I was 9 years old, and this is where I started to recognize what was wrong with it. We were constantly and randomly flogged for no specific reason, and I saw boys doing a lot of things that they should not do." In 1880, Albert's mother obtained a government job. At that time, his father had died, so the mother was able to remove her child from the orphanage. But that was too late after he had been greatly affected by what he had been exposed to in the orphanage. He learned how to enjoy violence and how to commit sadistic acts against others after he moved. Albert began to live with his mother. A friendship relationship began to form between him and one of the boys, and together they carried out some disgusting acts, such as drinking urine and being fascinated by abnormal sexual desires. In 1890, Albert had a new beginning with violence, as he moved during this year to New York and began to practice his crimes against children. He would harass them and tempt them to go with him far from their homes. He would also torture them using nails, knives, and sharp instruments, then assault them and often kill them and eat their flesh. Over time, his sexual fantasies grew and the crimes he committed against children became more diabolical and bizarre. Albert practiced his social life normally, and the amount of abnormality and violence within him did not prevent him from marrying in 1898. But because of his strange behavior, his wife was unable to continue her life with him. So his wife ran away in 1917 with another man, which made Albert greatly affected, and he entered into a worse psychological state and began to suffer from hallucinations. Auditory and his hallucinations took on a religious character, so he claimed that he was following the words of the prophet. What is surprising is that Albert did not extend his hand to harm his 6 children, even if they witnessed some of his strange behaviors, such as his love of eating raw meat. After the failure of Albert's marriage, he began to direct his violence towards women as well, in addition to children, so he began corresponding with some women. They asked them to perform ugly and disgusting sexual acts, but they were not accepted. These letters were later presented as evidence to convict Albert during his trial. From the beginning of his marriage, Albert was a house painter and also worked in many different states. Some suggest that he traveled a lot to be able to choose states inhabited by Americans. Of African descent, this was his goal, which he set intelligently and precisely, believing that the police would not spend as much time and effort searching for the killer of African American children compared to a Caucasian child. For this reason, most of his victims became black children or mentally disabled orphans, using sharp instruments to hurt them, all the way to driving nails into them. Their bodies, then he killed them, ate their meat, and sent letters to their families telling them how delicious their meat was. Albert was fond of imitating the German serial killer, Fritz Haarmann, who was addicted to raping male children and became famous by the nickname because his pleasure was to bite the child until the vampire died, and to also suck his blood in the year 1928. A young man named Edward Budd, who was 18 years old, published an advertisement in a newspaper stating his desire to look for work. Albert responded and introduced himself to him as Mr. Frank Howard, the farmer who was looking for a strong young man to work with him on his farm. Albert then set a date when he would come to take Edward to work on his farm. On time, he arrived bearing gifts for all the children of the young man's family and had lunch with them. After lunch, Albert explained to them that he had to go to a birthday party at his sister's house and that he would return later to take Edward to the farm. Then he suggested that their eldest daughter, Grace, who was 10 years old, join the birthday party to have fun with children of her age. Indeed, the parents prepared the girl, who was very excited, to attend the party, but she did not return home again after she went out with Albert. The investigation into Grace's disappearance continued for a full 6 years, during which no results emerged. The child's mother received an anonymous letter in 19344, informing her of the details of her daughter's murder. The sender was explaining to the mother how her daughter was stripped of her clothes, then strangled, cut into pieces, and eaten. By following this message, the police were able to reach a house where Albert Fish lived, and after he was arrested, he immediately began to confess to the murder of Grace and several other crimes. Albert was confessing the details of his crimes of torture and murder while smiling to the extent that made the investigators feel that they were seeing the devil himself. On March 11, 1935, the trial of Albert began as he deliberately tried to show his innocence by convincing the court that he was crazy and that there were voices in his head asking him to kill the children. These voices, she is what made him commit such horrific crimes. Although many psychiatrists confirmed that Albert was truly insane, the jury found that he was sane and guilty. After a short trial that did not exceed 10 days, he was sentenced to death by electrocution, a sentence that was implemented on January 16, 1936,